Tonight at 10 o'clock.
1 to 5 points. The loser gets none. Even round to mark with the next. Bell for round.
Alright, so the guy who's just been highlighted is of course the late great George Benton. His boxing record has been provided for your convenience, and of course you can see almost a 50% knockout percentage and 500 rounds of boxing.
The mandatory 8 count is in effect.
So the first thing we're going to take a look at in this video is of course Benton's boxing stance. George Benton made use of the old school boxing stance, but he did make a few modifications. And these modifications actually facilitated his Philly shell defensive style, which he became so widely known for. Of course, he's widely credited for being the founder of the Philly shell defense, of course hailing from Philadelphia. Okay, so here we have George Benton versus Johnny Smith. Let's take a look at his boxing stance. The first thing we see about Benton is that he moves his head off the center line. Benton would lean over to his right, placing most of his body weight on his trailing foot while remaining in a balanced position. This is of course the signature of the old school boxing stance. Now we're going to look at a comparison between the old school and the modern day stance. Now when you look at the modern day boxing stance, we notice that the boxer's head is actually on his center line. This means if the modern day boxer doesn't move his head as much, he's much more open to being hit and being chin checked by default, simply because his head rests on that center line. Notice also that the modern day boxing stance has the shoulders in a much more squared up position than the old school stance, which does allow the fighter to bob and weave and move side to side easily, but it also has its downsides. Notice that with the red line of your opponent, which is the line of attack of your opponent, resting on your center line and your head at the same time also resting on your center line, your opponent therefore has to make very few adjustments when he's punching to the head, because your head is typically resting on the center line. This is why in today's boxing, head movement as well as blocking and catching punches has become much more crucial than it's ever been, because fighters are keeping their heads on the center line. When you contrast this with the old school boxing stance, we see that the old school stance has the head moved off the center line. The left shoulder or the lead shoulder is acting as your first line of defense. Notice that the fighters typically tend to lean over slightly to the right hand side. When you combine this with the head being moved off the center line, the old school boxing stance forces your opponent's punches to travel just a little bit more distance, giving you more time to react to them. Notice also that the lead shoulder is closer to your opponent, meaning that your jab has less distance to travel. Additionally, with the right shoulder being further away, you can generate more power on the right hand in the old school boxing stance than you can in the new one. And also keep in mind the old school stance presents less of your chest to your opponent. Now finally, if you look at the red line, which is your opponent's line of attack, you can see that it is different from your center line. Your opponent does have to make a natural adjustment when punching to the head versus the old school boxing stance, because the head is off the center. Alright, so for this video, we're just going to play the film and I'm going to provide commentary as the film is playing. So there's a couple of things I want you to watch for. First and foremost, the right hand of George Benton and his ability to parry the jab. It's very, very difficult to land a jab on George Benton. There you see him parry the jab. Once again, look at the natural leaning over to the right hand side. The head is off the center line. Notice the natural leaning to the right hand side, allowing him to parry the jab as you're about to see, and then sit down into that position. Beautiful boxing from George Benton. This is what boxing is all about. Look at how he's able to, look at the balance of this guy, how he parries the jab. Do you see how he avoids the second jab there by just sitting down in that position? Good left hook there from Johnny Smith, catches Benton by surprise. There's a good jab from Benton moving to the left. There's another jab coming from Johnny Smith. It's just a bit of a rangefinder here just to measure his distance, just to see what he can do. It's a probing jab. Once again, the parry from George Benton coming up. Watch that right hand parry, and then he sits down into the position. Beautiful boxing. He has a very preemptive defense, or a proactive defense. Jab going to the left. Parries the jab from Johnny Smith. Notice how he just maintains his distance. Look at that lead shoulder being there to protect his chin as he shoots the jab. Now watch him step forward here and parry the jab. See how his boxing stance allows him, even when he steps forward and closes the distance, that right hand is always there to parry the jab. There's the natural lean over to the right hand side, head is off the center line, shoots the jab moving over to the left. There you see him just simply bend at the waist over to the right hand side to avoid the jab. There's that lead shoulder protecting his head, and then he slips to the inside, comes back with the left hook. He begins countering into the later in the rounds. In the beginning, he's just slipping the jab. Now he starts to throw in a couple counters there as well. And you see him protecting his center line there as Johnny Smith moves over to expose that center line. And you see George Benton just step over to the side to protect that center line, keep himself protected. And he's continue just measuring distance, and then you see him counter with the right hand to the body. Notice how Johnny Smith attempts to smother George Benton, but George Benton takes a step back and then uses the left hook to keep him at bay. Beautiful boxing. I mean, this is just tech, these are technicians in the ring right here, operating at a very high skill level. Notice how there's a natural bending at the knees from George Benton, which also facilitates his feints as well. Notice that as George Benton goes into this defensive posture, that he isn't as side on to his opponent as someone like Floyd Mayweather, for example. And then we see him parry the jab.
Benton has never been off his feet in a fight.
So now in the second round, watch how George Benton uses this left jab as he circles over to the left to change the angle. Now we're about to see him slip to the outside of this jab and then come back and counter with an overhand right. Beautiful counter punching from George Benton. He has the defensive awareness to step outside punching range immediately after delivering the punch. Now take a look at how he sneaks his lead foot over to the inside, slips the jab, puts himself in a perfect position to counter with the right hand. Very, very impressive technical skills from George Benton. So now we're going to see him avoid a couple jabs. He just leans back and then just sits down into the right hand position. The natural lean just allows George Benton to move himself away from these jabs. His head is already off center line. His opponent has to punch just a little bit more further to get to the head. And George Benton is able to just bend and dip to the outside to avoid these jabs, as you see him do again. And he just rolls the, I mean, this is just beautiful to watch. See how he rolls the right hand and comes back and catches the left hook. A great defensive fighter at the same time. He had a very, very good offensive set of tools as well. All right, so let's just take a look at how George Benton steps that lead foot forward, and you see him change levels and he feints, and you see how Johnny Smith is reacting to everything Benton does.
A minute to go in round two. Referee is Lee Grossman. He's going to make it. 4, 5, I'm sure he's not. 6, 7, 8, 9, and Johnny Smith is knocked out. It's a big win for George Benton.
Please make sure you click the red button to subscribe to my channel if you already haven't. Then check out some of my previous videos, or you could check out one of my more popular videos right now. Or you could do absolutely nothing and go out to the outro music.
My niggas, they killers and they some jag boys. Don't call my phone for a feature, I tax, you know it. Stalking bitch up on my line, I had to press ignore. Ran around with the slammer, never paranoid.